I never believed in ghosts until the night I spent in Blackwood Forest, alone with nothing but my tent and the shadows that moved between the trees. My name is Wade Hopkins. I am 27 years old, and what I experienced in those woods changed everything I thought I knew about the world. They say some places hold memories, that trauma seeps into the soil and replays itself for anyone foolish enough to witness it. I did not believe that either, not until I saw her standing at the edge of my campsite at 3 a.m., her face pale as moonlight, her eyes hollow and pleading. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. But the worst part, I would see her again, and again, and the story she was trying to tell me was more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. Before I tell you what happened in those woods, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were being watched in a place where you knew you were completely alone? Have you ever heard something that made your blood run cold, something that defied all logic and reason? If you have, drop a comment below and share your experience. I would love to know I am not the only one who has encountered something beyond explanation. And if you are new here, welcome. You are about to hear a story that still haunts me to this day. It started 3 months ago in late July. I had just gone through a brutal breakup and needed to clear my head. My ex, Jessica, had left me for someone else, and the apartment we shared suddenly felt suffocating. Every corner held a memory, every room echoed with arguments we had tried to forget. The couch where we used to watch movies together now felt like a monument to failure. The bed we had shared seemed too big, too empty. I would wake up in the middle of the night reaching for her, only to find cold sheets and the crushing realization that she was gone. Jessica had been my girlfriend for 3 years. We had met at a coffee shop in downtown Sacramento, one of those chance encounters that feels like fate. She had ordered a vanilla latte, I had ordered black coffee, and somehow we had ended up talking for 2 hours about everything and nothing. She was studying graphic design at the local college, and I was working as a software developer for a tech startup. We clicked instantly, and within 6 months, we had moved in together. But relationships are complicated, and ours had its share of problems. I worked long hours, often coming home exhausted and irritable. Jessica felt neglected, like I was prioritizing my career over her. We fought about it constantly. She wanted more attention, more quality time, more romance. I wanted her to understand that I was working hard for our future, that the long hours were temporary, that things would get better once I got promoted. But things never got better. The fights became more frequent, more bitter. And then one day I came home early from work and found her on the phone, laughing in a way I had not heard in months. She quickly hung up when she saw me, but the damage was done. I knew something was wrong. I asked her about it and she denied everything, said it was just a friend from class, but I did not believe her. 2 weeks later, she told me she was leaving. She had met someone else, someone who made her feel valued and appreciated, someone who was not married to his job. She packed her things that same day, and by evening she was gone, just like that. 3 years reduced to a few cardboard boxes and an empty closet. I spent the next week in a daze, going through the motions of daily life but feeling completely disconnected from everything. I could not focus at work, could not eat, could not sleep. My friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away. I did not want their pity or their advice. I just wanted to be alone. But being alone in that apartment was torture. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of Jessica. So I decided I needed to get away, to go somewhere far from the city, far from memories, far from people. I needed space to think, to process, to figure out who I was without her. That is when I remembered Tom, a coworker from the office. Tom was one of those outdoorsy types, always talking about his weekend camping trips and hiking adventures. We had gone out for drinks one night after work, and he had mentioned a place called Blackwood Forest, a hidden gem in Northern California that most people had never heard of. He said it was untouched, pristine, the kind of place where you could truly disconnect from the world. He said the silence there was profound, almost spiritual, and that spending time in those woods had helped him through a difficult period in his own life. At the time, I had not paid much attention. I was not really into camping, preferred hotels and room service to sleeping bags and campfires. But now, in the aftermath of my breakup, the idea of disappearing into the wilderness for a few days seemed perfect. I needed that silence Tom had described. I needed to be somewhere where my thoughts could not be drowned out by traffic and television and the constant hum of modern life. I spent the next day preparing for the trip. I went to a sporting goods store and bought the essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, a water filter, a first aid kit, and enough food to last 3 or 4 days. The sales clerk, a young guy with a friendly smile, tried to sell me all kinds of extras: bear spray, a satellite phone, a GPS tracker, but I declined. I wanted this trip to be simple, just me and the forest, nothing else. I also bought a topographical map of the area around Blackwood Forest. Tom had given me vague directions, said to take Highway 5 north and look for an unmarked turnoff about 10 miles past the town of Redding. The map showed a vast expanse of green, with only a few trails marked. It looked remote, isolated, exactly what I was looking for. The night before I left, I could not sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of Jessica, of the trip, of what I hoped to find in those woods. Part of me wondered if I was making a mistake, if running away to the forest was just another form of avoidance. But another part of me knew I needed this. I needed to prove to myself that I could be okay on my own, that I did not need Jessica or anyone else to define my happiness. I finally drifted off around 3 a.m., and when my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I felt groggy and disoriented. But I forced myself out of bed, showered, dressed, and loaded my gear into the back of my truck. By 7 a.m., I was on the road, heading north. The drive took about 6 hours. I left Sacramento just as the morning rush hour was starting, the highways clogged with commuters heading to work. But as I drove further north, the traffic thinned out and the landscape began to change. The flat, urban sprawl of the Central Valley gave way to rolling hills covered in dry grass and scattered oaks. The air grew cooler, fresher, and I rolled down the windows, letting the wind whip through the cab. I stopped for lunch at a small diner in Redding, a classic roadside establishment with vinyl booths and a menu laminated in plastic. I ordered a burger and fries, and while I ate, I studied the map, trying to memorize the route to Blackwood Forest. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, noticed the map and asked if I was heading into the mountains. I told her I was going camping, and she smiled and said I had picked a good time of year. The weather was warm but not too hot, and the crowds had not yet arrived for the peak summer season. After lunch, I continued north on Highway 5, watching the mile markers tick by. The highway climbed steadily, winding through foothills dotted with pines and firs. The air grew cooler still, and I could smell the sharp, clean scent of evergreens. After about 10 miles, I saw the turnoff Tom had described, a narrow dirt road branching off to the left. There was no sign, no indication of where it led, just a gap in the trees and a rutted track disappearing into the forest. I slowed down and turned onto the dirt road. My truck bounced and jostled over the uneven surface, and I had to slow to a crawl to avoid scraping the undercarriage on rocks and roots. The road was barely wide enough for one vehicle, and branches scraped against the sides of the truck, leaving faint scratches on the paint. But I did not care. I was already feeling a sense of liberation, a loosening of the tight knot of anxiety that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. The road wound through the forest for about 2 miles, climbing gradually upward. The trees grew thicker and taller, their canopy blocking out much of the sunlight. It was like driving through a tunnel of green, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I turned off the air conditioning and opened the windows wider, breathing in the cool, piney air. Finally, the road ended in a small clearing, just big enough to park a couple of vehicles. There were no other cars, no signs of recent use, just tire tracks half filled with pine needles and weeds growing in the ruts. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the silence. It was profound, almost overwhelming. No traffic, no voices, no mechanical sounds. just the whisper of wind in the trees and the distant trill of a bird. I climbed out of the truck and stretched, feeling the tension in my shoulders and back begin to ease. The air was cool and fresh, tinged with the smell of pine resin and damp earth. I took a deep breath and looked around. The clearing was surrounded by towering Douglas firs and ponderosa pines, their trunks thick and straight, their bark rough and deeply furrowed. The ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, soft and springy underfoot. I grabbed my backpack from the truck, along with my tent, sleeping bag, and cooler. The pack was heavy, loaded with food, water, and gear, and I had to adjust the straps several times before it felt comfortable. I also grabbed my trekking poles, a set of collapsible aluminum poles that would help me keep my balance on uneven terrain. There was a trail marker at the edge of the clearing, a weathered wooden post with a faded sign pointing into the forest. The sign read Blackwood Creek Trail 3 miles. I shouldered my pack and set off down the trail, my boots crunching on the pine needles, my breath coming easily in the cool mountain air. The trail was well maintained, winding gently upward through the forest. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating patches of ferns and wildflowers. I saw columbines, lupins, and Indian paintbrush, their colors bright against the green backdrop. The trail followed the contour of the hillside, crossing several small streams that gurgled over moss-covered rocks. As I hiked, I felt my mind begin to quiet. The constant chatter of thoughts and worries that had plagued me for weeks started to fade, replaced by a simple, meditative awareness of my surroundings. I noticed the way the light played on the leaves, the texture of the bark on the trees, the sound of my footsteps on the trail. It was a kind of mindfulness I had not experienced in a long time, and it felt good. After about an hour, the trail descended into a narrow valley, and I heard the sound of running water growing louder. I rounded a bend and saw Blackwood Creek, a clear, fast-flowing stream that tumbled over smooth stones and fallen logs. The water was icy cold, fed by snowmelt from the higher elevations. I knelt beside the creek and splashed some water on my face, gasping at the cold but feeling instantly refreshed. I followed the creek upstream for another half-mile, looking for a good place to camp. I wanted a spot that was flat and dry, with access to water but not so close that I would be bothered by mosquitoes. Finally, I found a perfect clearing on a slight rise above the creek. The ground was level and covered in soft pine needles, and there was a natural fire ring made of stones, evidence that other campers had used this spot before. I dropped my pack and took a moment to catch my breath. The clearing was beautiful, surrounded by tall trees and filled with dappled sunlight. The sound of the creek was soothing, a constant burble that would provide white noise at night. I could not have asked for a better campsite. I spent the next hour setting up camp. I pitched my tent, a 2-person dome with a rainfly, staking it securely to the ground and making sure the zippers worked smoothly. I laid out my sleeping bag and pad inside, along with my flashlight and a book I had brought along. Then I set up my camp kitchen, arranging my stove, fuel canister, and cooking gear on a flat rock near the fire ring. I gathered firewood from the surrounding area, collecting dead branches and fallen logs that were dry enough to burn. I built a neat stack near the fire ring, making sure I had enough wood to last through the evening. Then I filled my water bottles from the creek, using my filter to remove any impurities. By the time I finished setting up camp, it was late afternoon. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat down on a fallen log and just breathed, taking in the beauty and tranquility of my surroundings. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. This was exactly what I needed. I cooked a simple dinner over my camp stove, dehydrated chili that I rehydrated with boiling water, along with some crackers and cheese. It was not gourmet, but it tasted amazing after the long hike. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, and washed it down with cold water from the creek. As the sun set, the temperature began to drop. I pulled on a fleece jacket and lit the fire. using a fire starter cube and some dry twigs to get it going. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. I added larger pieces of wood, feeding the fire until it was burning steadily, radiating warmth and light. I sat by the fire for hours, watching the flames dance and flicker, listening to the sounds of the forest at night. I heard owls hooting in the distance, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig. But mostly, I heard silence. Deep, profound silence that seemed to wrap around me like a blanket. I thought about Jessica, about our relationship, about the mistakes I had made. I realized that I had been so focused on my career, on proving myself, on climbing the ladder, that I had neglected the things that truly mattered. I had taken Jessica for granted, assumed she would always be there, and now she was gone. It was a painful realization, but also a necessary one. I needed to learn from this, to grow, to become a better person. Around 10 p.m., I decided it was time for bed. I doused the fire with water from the creek, making sure every ember was extinguished, and then crawled into my tent. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, turned off my flashlight, and lay in the darkness, listening to the creek and the wind in the trees. Sleep came surprisingly easily. I was exhausted from the drive and the hike, and the fresh air and physical exertion had left me pleasantly tired. I drifted off, my mind quiet, my body relaxed, feeling more at peace than I had in months. But that peace would not last. I do not know what time it was when I woke up, but it was deep in the night, the kind of darkness that is absolute and disorienting. My heart was pounding, my body covered in a cold sweat, and I had the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I lay perfectly still, trying to figure out what had woken me. There had been no sound, no movement, just a sudden, inexplicable jolt of fear that had yanked me from sleep. I reached for my watch, pressing the button to illuminate the dial. It was 3 a.m. I lay there, listening, my senses straining in the darkness. The creek was still burbling in the background, but everything else was silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the pine needles outside my tent. My entire body went rigid. Someone was out there. Someone was walking around my campsite in the middle of the night. My first thought was that another camper had arrived, maybe someone who had gotten lost and stumbled upon my site. But that did not make sense. It was 3 a.m., pitch black, and there was no light from a flashlight or headlamp. Who would be wandering around in the dark without a light? The footsteps continued, circling the clearing, coming closer to my tent. I could hear them clearly now, the soft crunch, crunch, crunch of someone walking slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I thought whoever was out there must be able to hear it. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling so badly I could barely grip it. I fumbled with the switch and finally got it turned on. The beam of light illuminated the thin nylon walls of my tent, and I could see shadows moving outside, dark shapes that shifted and swayed. I had to know what was out there. I could not just lie here in the darkness, paralyzed by fear. I took a deep breath, gripped the flashlight tightly, and slowly unzipped the tent flap. The sound of the zipper seemed deafeningly loud in the silence, and the footsteps stopped abruptly. I pushed open the flap and shone the flashlight out into the clearing. There was nothing there. The clearing was empty, bathed in the pale beam of my flashlight. The fire ring was cold and dark. The trees stood silent and still, and there was no sign of anyone or anything. I swept the flashlight beam across the entire area, searching every shadow, every gap between the trees, but I saw nothing. I crawled out of the tent, standing up on shaky legs, and walked to the center of the clearing. The night air was cold, biting through my thin t-shirt, and I shivered. I turned in a slow circle, shining the light in every direction, but the forest was empty and silent. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe the footsteps had been part of some nightmare and I had woken up in a panic. That seemed like the most logical explanation. I was stressed, emotionally drained, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I went back to my tent, zipped myself inside, and lay down. But I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence felt unnatural, too complete, as if every living thing in the forest was hiding. I kept the flashlight on, clutching it in my hand, and stared at the ceiling of the tent until exhaustion finally dragged me back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already high in the sky, its light filtering through the tent fabric and filling the interior with a warm, golden glow. I checked my watch. It was almost 9 a.m. I had slept much later than I usually did, a sign of how exhausted I had been. I crawled out of the tent and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my muscles from sleeping on the ground. The morning air was cool and fresh, and the forest was alive with sound. Birds were singing in the trees, squirrels were chattering as they chased each other through the branches, and the creek was burbling cheerfully in the background. Everything looked completely normal. The clearing was exactly as I had left it, with no signs of disturbance. I walked around the perimeter, looking for footprints or any indication that someone had been there during the night, but the pine needle carpet was undisturbed. I felt foolish for having been so frightened. Clearly, I had been dreaming, or my imagination had gotten the better of me. I decided to put the whole thing out of my mind. I was here to relax, to clear my head, not to work myself into a state of paranoia. I made breakfast, heating water on my camp stove and making instant oatmeal with dried fruit. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth of the food and the peaceful morning, and then I set out to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream, hopping from rock to rock, climbing over fallen logs and pushing through dense thickets of ferns. The forest was beautiful, untouched and wild, with massive trees that must have been hundreds of years old. I felt small and insignificant in the presence of such ancient life, but it was a good feeling, a humbling reminder of my place in the natural world. After about a mile, I came to a small waterfall, where the creek plunged over a rocky ledge into a deep pool below. The pool was crystal clear, and I could see smooth stones on the bottom, along with a few small fish darting through the water. I stripped down to my underwear and dove in, gasping at the icy shock of the cold water. It was invigorating, washing away the last remnants of fear from the night before. I swam for a while, floating on my back and staring up at the canopy of trees overhead. The sun was warm on my face, the water was cool on my body, and I felt more alive than I had in months. This was what I had come here for, this moment of peace and connection with nature. I dried off in the sun and then hiked back to my campsite, feeling refreshed and optimistic. I spent the afternoon reading, napping, and just enjoying the solitude. I cooked dinner over the fire as the sun set, watching the colors change from gold to orange to deep purple. The night was clear and the stars began to appear, thousands of them, brilliant and sharp in the darkness. I felt good. I felt like I was starting to heal, to let go of the pain and anger I had been carrying around. Maybe this trip was exactly what I needed. But as night fell, that sense of peace began to evaporate. I could not shake the memory of the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but doubt gnawed at me. I found myself glancing nervously at the shadows between the trees, jumping at every sound. I went to bed early, around 9 p.m., hoping that sleep would come quickly and I would wake up refreshed and ready to enjoy another day. But sleep did not come. I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening to the sounds of the night. And as the hours ticked by, my unease grew. At 3 a.m., I woke up again. Or rather, I realized I had never really been asleep, just dozing fitfully, hovering on the edge of consciousness. And the moment I opened my eyes, I knew something was out there. I could feel it, a presence standing just outside my tent. I did not hear footsteps this time, did not hear any sound at all. but I knew with absolute certainty that something was standing mere feet away, separated from me by only a thin layer of nylon. My breath caught in my throat. I did not dare move, did not dare make a sound. I just lay there frozen, staring at the tent wall. And then I saw it. A shadow, a silhouette outlined against the fabric of the tent by the faint moonlight. The shape of a person standing perfectly still directly in front of the entrance. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but lie there helpless. But I could not move. I was paralyzed by fear, every muscle in my body locked tight. The silhouette did not move. It just stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. And then slowly, I forced myself to reach for my flashlight. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely grip it, but I managed to turn it on. I pointed the beam at the tent entrance and threw open the flap. She was standing there. A woman, pale as death, her skin almost luminous in the darkness. She was wearing a white nightgown that hung loosely on her thin frame, and her long dark hair fell around her face in tangled strands. But it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were wide and staring, filled with a desperate, pleading intensity that froze me in place. We stared at each other for a long moment, neither of us moving. And then she opened her mouth, her lips forming words, but no sound came out. She was trying to speak, trying to tell me something, but I could not hear her. It was as if she was behind glass or in a vacuum, unable to make her voice reach me. I tried to speak, to ask who she was, what she wanted, but my throat was closed tight with fear. I could not make a sound. We just stood there, locked in a silent confrontation, her eyes boring into mine, her mouth moving soundlessly. And then she was gone. Not walking away, not fading gradually into the darkness. Just gone, vanished in an instant, as if she had never been there at all. One moment she was standing in front of me, the next the clearing was empty. I scrambled out of my tent, shining the flashlight wildly in all directions. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Nothing but the burble of the creek and the whisper of wind in the trees. I stood there for a long time, my whole body shaking, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It could not have been real. Ghosts did not exist. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I had been sleepwalking or hallucinating or experiencing some kind of waking dream. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The woman had been there, standing in front of my tent, trying to communicate with me. And she had not been human. She had been something else, something supernatural. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, feeding it logs to keep the flames high, and watched the darkness, waiting for her to appear again. But she did not. The night passed slowly, agonizingly, and when the sun finally rose, I felt exhausted and shaken. I should have left right then. I should have packed up my gear, hiked back to my truck, and driven home as fast as I could. But something kept me there. I wanted to understand what I had seen. I needed to know if it was real, if I was losing my mind, or if something truly paranormal was happening in these woods. I spent the day in a daze, unable to focus on anything. I tried to read but could not concentrate. I tried to eat but had no appetite. I just sat by the creek, staring at the water, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. As evening approached, I made a decision. I would stay one more night. If I saw her again, I would try to communicate with her, to find out what she wanted. And if I did not see her, I would leave in the morning and try to forget the whole thing. That night, I prepared myself. I had my flashlight ready, a notebook and pen in case I needed to write something down, and I stayed fully clothed in my sleeping bag. I was not going to be caught off guard again. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually won out. I dozed off sometime after midnight, drifting in and out of a fitful sleep, and at 3 a.m. I woke up. She was there again, standing in the same spot at the edge of the clearing, her pale face glowing faintly in the moonlight. But this time, I was ready. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of the tent before fear could paralyze me. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. "What do you want?" She did not answer. She just stared at me with those haunted eyes, her lips moving silently. And then slowly, she raised one arm and pointed into the forest, deeper into the trees. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You want me to follow you?" She nodded just once, and then began to back away into the trees, still pointing, her eyes never leaving mine. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay where I was, to not follow this ghost into the dark forest. But I found myself moving forward, drawn by some force I could not explain. I grabbed my flashlight and started after her. She moved through the forest like smoke, gliding over the ground, never making a sound. I struggled to keep up, stumbling over roots and rocks, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. She stayed just ahead of me, always visible but always out of reach, leading me deeper into the woods. We walked for what felt like miles, though it could have been much less. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush denser. I had no idea where I was or how I would find my way back, but I could not stop. I had to know where she was taking me. Finally, she stopped. We had entered a small clearing, much smaller than the one where I had camped. The ground was uneven, covered in dead leaves and broken branches, and in the center of the clearing was a pile of stones, arranged in a rough circle. The woman stood beside the stones, pointing down at them, her expression anguished. I approached slowly, shining my flashlight at the pile. They were not just random stones. It was a cairn, a burial marker, and carved into the largest stone, barely visible beneath layers of moss and lichen, was a name and 2 dates. Emily Graves, 1989-2012. I stared at the carving, my mind reeling. Emily Graves. This was a grave. Someone had been buried here in the middle of the forest, far from any trail or road. And this ghost, this woman in white, was connected to it somehow. I looked up at her, but she was gone again. I was alone in the clearing, standing over a secret grave, surrounded by darkness and silence. And then I heard it, a whisper so faint I almost missed it, a woman's voice, soft and sad, carried on the wind. "Help me." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees, filling my head. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. "Help me find my way home." The voice was clearer now, more insistent. It was her voice, the ghost's voice. She was speaking to me, pleading with me. "How?" I called out into the darkness. "How can I help you?" But there was no answer. The forest fell silent again, and I was left standing there, alone and terrified, with more questions than answers. I did not know how long I stood there, but eventually my survival instincts kicked in. I needed to get back to my campsite. I needed to get out of these woods. I turned and started walking, trying to retrace my steps, but in the darkness, everything looked the same. I had no idea which direction I had come from. I walked for hours, or what felt like hours, crashing through the underbrush, panic rising in my chest. I was lost, completely and utterly lost, in the middle of a forest that suddenly felt hostile and threatening. Just when I was about to give up, to sit down and wait for daylight, I saw a glimmer of light through the trees. My campfire. Somehow, impossibly, I had found my way back. I stumbled into the clearing, my clothes torn and dirty, my hands bleeding from where I had grabbed at branches and rocks. I collapsed beside the fire pit, gasping for breath, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Dawn was coming. I had survived the night. But I knew I could not stay here any longer. Whatever was happening in these woods, it was beyond my understanding, beyond my ability to cope. I needed to leave, to get back to civilization, to try to make sense of what I had experienced. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling, my mind racing. I did not bother with being organized or careful. I just threw everything into my pack and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The hike back was a blur. I moved as fast as I could, almost running, desperate to get out of those trees. By the time I reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat, my legs shaking with exhaustion. I threw my gear in the back and started the engine, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I drove away from Blackwood Forest as fast as the rutted dirt road would allow, not looking back, not slowing down until I reached the main highway. And even then, I did not feel safe. I felt like something was following me, watching me, waiting. I drove for about 20 miles before I saw a sign for a town called Millerton. I needed to stop, to catch my breath, to try to process everything that had happened. I pulled off the highway and followed the signs into town. Millerton was a small, quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone. There was a main street with a few shops, a gas station, a post office, and a diner. I parked in front of the diner and went inside. The interior was classic small-town America, checkered tablecloths, a long counter with stools, and the smell of coffee and bacon in the air. There were only a few customers, mostly older folks who glanced up at me curiously as I entered. I slid into a booth near the window and ordered coffee from the waitress, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a kind, weathered face. My hands were still shaking as I wrapped them around the warm mug. I needed answers. I needed to know who Emily Graves was and what had happened to her, and I had a feeling this town might have those answers. When the waitress came back to refill my coffee, I took a chance. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was camping up in Blackwood Forest and I found something strange, a grave with a name carved on it, Emily Graves. Do you know anything about that?" The waitress's expression changed instantly. The warmth drained from her face, replaced by something I could not quite identify. Sadness, fear, recognition. She glanced around the diner as if checking to see who might be listening, and then she pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. "Where did you say you found this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "In Blackwood Forest," I said. "About a mile or two from where I was camping. It was a cairn, stones piled up with her name carved on the biggest one. Emily Graves, 1989 to 2012. The waitress closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, they were glistening with unshed tears. "Emily," she said softly. "God, I have not heard that name in years. Most folks around here do not talk about her anymore. It is too painful." "Who was she?" I asked. The waitress looked at me for a long moment as if deciding whether to trust me. Finally, she spoke. "Emily Graves was a local girl, born and raised right here in Millerton. She was a sweet kid, always smiling, always trying to help people. She worked at the grocery store on Main Street and everyone loved her. She had her whole life ahead of her." "What happened to her?" "She went missing in the summer of 2012, the waitress said, her voice thick with emotion. "She was 23 years old. She had gone camping in Blackwood Forest with her boyfriend, a guy named Travis Keller. They were supposed to come back after the weekend, but only Travis came back. He said Emily had wandered off in the middle of the night and he could not find her. He said he searched for hours, but she was just gone." I felt a chill run down my spine. Did they search for her? "Oh, they searched," the waitress said. "The police, search and rescue teams, volunteers from town. They combed through those woods for weeks, but they never found her, not a trace. No clothing, no footprints, nothing. It was like she had vanished into thin air." "What about the boyfriend, Travis?" The waitress's expression hardened. "Travis stuck to his story. Said they had been sleeping in their tent and he woke up around 3 a.m. and she was gone. He claimed he called out for her, searched the area with his flashlight but could not find her. So he hiked back to town and called the police." "Did anyone believe him?" "Some did, some did not," she said. "The police questioned him for hours, but there was no evidence of foul play. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing. And without a body, they could not charge him with anything. Eventually, they had to let him go. "What do you think happened?" I asked. The waitress leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. "I think Travis Keller knows exactly what happened to Emily. I think he did something to her and then covered it up. But I cannot prove it, and neither could the police. He moved away about 6 months after Emily disappeared. Last I heard, he was living somewhere up in Oregon." I sat back, my mind racing. Emily Graves had been murdered, or at least that is what this woman believed, and her body had been left in the forest, buried under a pile of stones. But if Travis had buried her, why would he have carved her name on the stone? That did not make sense, unless someone else had found her body and created the cairn. "Has anyone else reported finding that grave?" I asked. The waitress shook her head. "Not that I know of. But then again, not many people go into Blackwood Forest anymore. It has a reputation. People say it is haunted, that strange things happen there. Some campers have reported seeing a woman in white, hearing whispers in the night. Most folks just stay away." My blood ran cold. A woman in white. "Yeah," the waitress said. "Pale, wearing a nightgown, long dark hair. Some say it is Emily's ghost, still wandering those woods looking for a way home." I could not breathe. What she was describing was exactly what I had seen. The woman who had appeared at my campsite, who had led me to the grave, was Emily Graves. Her ghost was trapped in those woods, unable to rest, unable to find peace. "I saw her," I said quietly. The waitress stared at me, her eyes wide. "You saw Emily?" I nodded. "She appeared at my campsite 2 nights in a row. She did not speak, but she led me to the grave. And then I heard her voice, telling me to help her find her way home." The waitress reached across the table and gripped my hand. Her fingers were cold and trembling. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "If Emily is reaching out to you, there is a reason. She wants someone to know the truth. She wants justice. You need to go to the police and tell them what you found." "Will they believe me?" I asked. "I do not know," she admitted. "But you have to try. Emily deserves that much." I finished my coffee and paid the bill, thanking the waitress for the information. She gave me directions to the police station, a small building on the edge of town, and I drove there immediately. The Millerton Police Station was a modest, single-story building with a parking lot in front. I walked inside and approached the front desk, where a young officer sat typing on a computer. "Can I help you?" he asked, looking up at me. "I need to report something," I said. "I found a grave in Blackwood Forest, a woman named Emily Graves." The officer's fingers froze on the keyboard. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he stood up. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared through a door behind the desk. A few minutes later, an older man emerged, wearing a sheriff's uniform. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He extended his hand. "I am Sheriff Dawson," he said. "I understand you have information about Emily Graves." I shook his hand and nodded. "I was camping in Blackwood Forest, and I found a cairn with her name on it. I think it might be where she was buried." Sheriff Dawson's expression was grave. "Come with me," he said, leading me to a small office in the back. He gestured for me to sit down, and then he took a seat behind his desk, pulling out a notepad and pen. "Tell me everything," he said. I told him the whole story. The camping trip, the footsteps, the ghost, being led to the grave. I left nothing out, even the parts that made me sound crazy. I figured if I was going to do this, I might as well be honest. Sheriff Dawson listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "I remember Emily's case," he said quietly. "I was a deputy back then, and I was part of the search team. We spent weeks in those woods, and we never found a damn thing. It has haunted me ever since." "Do you think Travis Keller killed her?" I asked. "I always suspected it," the sheriff admitted. "But we had no evidence. No body, no weapon, no witnesses. Just his word against thin air. I interviewed him myself and I got the feeling he was hiding something, but without proof, our hands were tied. "What if I could show you where the grave is?" I said. "What if we could recover her body? Would that be enough to reopen the case?" Sheriff Dawson leaned forward, his eyes intense. "If you can lead us to human remains, and if those remains are Emily Graves, then yes, we would absolutely reopen the investigation. But I need to know you are serious about this. I am not going to waste resources on a wild goose chase." "I am serious," I said. "I know exactly where the grave is. I can take you there." The sheriff studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let me make some calls. We will need a search team, maybe some forensic specialists. This is going to take some time to organize." "How long?" I asked. "Give me a day or two," he said. "I will call you when we are ready. Leave your contact information with the front desk." I gave the young officer my name and phone number, and then I left the station. I felt both relieved and anxious. I had done what I could. Now I just had to wait. I checked into a motel in Millerton, a small place called the Pine View Inn. The room was basic but clean, with a bed, a television, and a bathroom. I took a long, hot shower, washing away days of dirt and fear, and then I collapsed on the bed. But I could not sleep. My mind was too active, replaying everything that had happened. I kept seeing Emily's face, her haunted eyes, her silent plea for help. I wondered if she knew I was trying to help her, if she could somehow sense what I was doing. That night, lying in the dark motel room, I felt her presence again. It was not as strong as it had been in the forest, but it was there, a subtle awareness that I was not alone. I was not afraid this time. Instead, I felt a strange sense of companionship, as if Emily was watching over me, grateful that someone was finally listening. "I am going to help you," I whispered into the darkness. "I promise." There was no response, but I felt a warmth in my chest, a sense of peace that I had not felt in days. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Sheriff Dawson called me 2 days later. They had assembled a search team and were ready to go into Blackwood Forest. He asked if I could meet them at the trailhead the following morning at 8 a.m. I agreed, and the next day I drove back to the forest. When I arrived, there were several vehicles parked in the clearing: police SUVs, a van from the county coroner's office, and a few personal trucks. About a dozen people were milling around, checking equipment and reviewing maps. Sheriff Dawson saw me and walked over. "You ready for this?" he asked. "As ready as I will ever be," I said. "All right," he said, "lead the way." We set off into the forest, following the trail to my old campsite. From there, I tried to retrace the path I had taken when following Emily's ghost. It was harder than I expected. In the daylight, everything looked different, and I was not sure I could remember the exact route. But something guided me. Maybe it was memory, or maybe it was something else, some invisible thread pulling me forward. I led the team deeper into the woods, veering off the trail and into the dense underbrush. The sheriff and his deputies followed closely, along with 2 forensic specialists carrying equipment. After about an hour of hiking, I recognized a distinctive rock formation, a cluster of boulders covered in bright green moss. I remembered passing it on my journey. "This way," I said, pointing to the left. We pushed through a thick stand of ferns and emerged into a small clearing. And there, in the center, was the cairn. Sheriff Dawson approached it slowly, his expression somber. He knelt beside the pile of stones and examined the carved name. "Emily Graves," he read aloud. "This is it." The forensic team moved in, carefully photographing the site from every angle. Then, with painstaking care, they began to remove the stones, one by one, setting them aside in a neat pile. It took over an hour, but eventually they reached the bottom of the cairn. And there, partially covered by dirt and leaves, were human remains. The bones were old, bleached white by time and weather, but they were unmistakably human. A skull, a rib cage, long bones from arms and legs. The forensic specialists worked carefully, documenting everything, collecting samples. Sheriff Dawson stood beside me, his jaw clenched. 13 years, he said quietly. She has been here for 13 years. One of the forensic specialists approached us. We will need to transport the remains back to the lab for analysis, she said. But based on preliminary examination, these are consistent with a human female in her early 20s. We will be able to confirm identity through dental records. How long will that take? The sheriff asked. A few days, maybe a week, she said. We stayed at the site for several more hours while the team completed their work. When they finally finished, the remains were carefully placed in body bags and carried back to the trailhead. The forensic van drove away, and the clearing fell silent once more. Sheriff Dawson turned to me. "You did a good thing here," he said. "Emily's family can finally have closure, and if we are lucky, we might be able to build a case against Travis Keller." "Will you be able to find him?" I asked. "We will find him," the sheriff said grimly. "And when we do, he is going to answer for what he did." I drove back to Millerton and checked into the motel again. I wanted to be there when the identification came back, wanted to see this through to the end. The wait was agonizing. Days passed slowly, each one stretching out like an eternity. I spent my time walking around the town, talking to locals, learning more about Emily. Everyone had a story about her, a memory of her kindness and warmth. She had been loved by this community, and her disappearance had left a wound that had never fully healed. Finally, on the 6th day, Sheriff Dawson called. "The dental records came back," he said. "It is Emily. We have a positive identification." I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Emily had been found. She could finally rest. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we reopen the investigation," the sheriff said, "and we bring Travis Keller in for questioning." "Have you found him?" "We have," he said. "He is living in a town called Riverside, Oregon. I have already contacted the local police there. They are going to pick him up and hold him until we can get there." "Can I come with you?" I asked. The sheriff hesitated. "This is official police business," he said. "I should not really allow it." "Please," I said. "I need to see this through. Emily reached out to me for a reason. I need to be there." He sighed. "All right, but you stay in the car. You do not interfere, understood?" "Understood," I said. The next day, Sheriff Dawson and I drove to Oregon. It was a long trip, about 8 hours, and we spent most of it in silence. The sheriff was focused on the case, reviewing files and making phone calls. I just stared out the window, thinking about Emily, about everything that had led to this moment. We arrived in Riverside in the late afternoon. The local police had already picked up Travis Keller and were holding him at the station. Sheriff Dawson went inside while I waited in the car, my heart pounding. About an hour later, the sheriff emerged, followed by 2 officers escorting a man in handcuffs. Travis Keller was in his late 30s, with thinning hair and a haggard appearance. He looked like a man who had been running from his past for far too long. They put him in the back of a police car, and Sheriff Dawson returned to his vehicle. "He has agreed to waive extradition," he said. "We are taking him back to California. He will be arraigned in a couple of days." "Did he confess?" I asked. "Not yet," the sheriff said, "but he will. I can see it in his eyes. He knows it is over." We drove back to California, this time with a police escort transporting Travis. It was a long, tense journey, and I found myself watching the police car ahead of us, wondering what was going through Travis's mind. When we arrived back in Millerton, Travis was taken to the county jail. Sheriff Dawson told me he would keep me updated on the case, and I thanked him for allowing me to be part of the investigation. That night I lay in my motel room, exhausted but unable to sleep. I kept thinking about Emily, about her ghost, about the desperate plea for help. And then, around 3 a.m., I felt her presence again. She was standing at the foot of the bed, her pale form glowing faintly in the darkness. But this time she was different. Her expression was not anguished or pleading. It was peaceful, almost serene. She looked at me, and for the first time she smiled. And then she was gone. Not vanishing abruptly like before, but fading slowly, gently, like morning mist evaporating in the sunlight. I knew in that moment that Emily had found her peace. She had gotten the justice she deserved, and she was finally free. The next morning, Sheriff Dawson called with an update. Travis confessed, he said. Early this morning, he could not take the guilt anymore. What did he say? I asked. He said exactly what we suspected, the sheriff replied. He and Emily had been fighting that night. She wanted to break up with him, told him she had feelings for someone else. Travis was drunk and angry. They argued, and in a moment of rage, he pushed her. She fell and hit her head on a rock. He checked for a pulse, but she was gone. I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. Such a senseless, tragic death. What did he do after? I asked. He panicked, the sheriff said. He buried her right there, made the cairn to mark the spot. He carved her name on the stone because he felt guilty, thought maybe someone would find her someday. Then he hiked back to town and made up the story about her wandering off. And he has been living with that lie ever since. Yeah, the sheriff said. 13 years of guilt eating away at him. I almost feel sorry for the guy. Almost. What will happen to him? He is being charged with manslaughter, the sheriff said, given the circumstances. The passage of time and his confession, he will probably get somewhere between 10 to 20 years. But at least Emily's family finally has answers. They can give her a proper burial and have some closure. A few days later, I attended Emily's funeral. It was held at a small church in Millerton, and the entire town seemed to turn out. The service was beautiful, filled with stories about Emily's kindness and generosity. Her parents were there, older and worn by grief, but grateful that their daughter had finally been found. After the service, Emily's mother approached me. She was a small woman with gray hair and eyes that looked like they had cried 1,000 tears. "You are the young man who found her," she said. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing our Emily home." Tears streamed down my face. "I am so sorry for your loss," I managed to say. "She is at peace now," her mother said. "I can feel it. She is finally at peace." I stayed for the burial, watching as Emily's casket was lowered into the ground at the Millerton Cemetery. It was a sunny day, warm and peaceful, with birds singing in the trees. As the pastor said the final prayers, I felt a gentle breeze brush past me, warm and comforting, like a hand on my shoulder. "Goodbye, Emily," I thought. "Rest easy now." After the funeral, I drove back to Sacramento. The apartment that had felt so suffocating before now seemed different somehow. It was still empty, still echoing with memories of Jessica, but it did not feel oppressive anymore. I had been through something profound, something that put my own problems into perspective. Yes, my relationship had ended. Yes, I was hurt and lonely, but I was alive. I had my whole life ahead of me, full of possibilities and second chances. Emily never got that chance. Her life had been cut short by a moment of violence, and she had spent 13 years as a restless spirit, unable to find peace. But now she was free, and in helping her, I had found something I had not been looking for: purpose. I had made a difference. I had brought justice to someone who could not speak for herself. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during my relationship with Jessica. I started exercising regularly, eating better, taking care of myself. I even started seeing a therapist to work through my feelings about the breakup and the traumatic experience in Blackwood Forest. Slowly, I began to heal. Travis Keller went to trial 4 months later. I attended, sitting in the courtroom and listening as the prosecutor laid out the evidence. Travis pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, and the judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison. It was not enough, not really, but it was something. Justice had been served. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a sense of closure. This chapter of my life was over. Emily's story had been told, her killer had been punished, and I could finally move on. But I never forgot her. I never forgot those nights in Blackwood Forest, the pale figure standing at the edge of the clearing, the desperate whisper asking for help. Emily Graves had reached across the veil between life and death to find someone who would listen, someone who would care enough to seek the truth. And I am glad it was me. Before I close out this story, I want to say thank you for listening. This experience changed me in ways I am still trying to understand. It taught me that there are things in this world beyond our comprehension, forces and presences that exist in the shadows. It taught me that the dead sometimes need advocates, people who will fight for them when they can no longer fight for themselves. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who loves true paranormal experiences. Your support means everything and helps me continue sharing these stories. And if you have ever experienced something unexplainable, something that defies logic and reason, please leave a comment below. I read every single one, and I would love to hear your story. As for me, I have not been back to Blackwood Forest. I do not think I ever will. Some places are marked by tragedy, and they hold onto that darkness long after the events have passed. But I do think about Emily often, especially on warm summer nights when the stars are bright and the world is quiet. I like to imagine her at peace now, reunited with her family in whatever comes after this life. I like to think that she is no longer trapped in those dark woods, no longer wandering and lost. I like to think that she found her way home. And maybe, in some small way, I helped her get there. This is Wade signing off. Stay safe out there, and remember, if you ever encounter something you cannot explain, do not ignore it. Sometimes the dead are trying to tell us something. Sometimes they need our help to find peace. And sometimes answering their call can change everything. Thank you for listening to my story. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep your eyes open. You never know what you might encounter in the darkness.